we look at this story about a man who was healed, a pretty miraculous healing, a man who hadn't been able to walk for 38 years now, able to walk and run about and be mobile again. We've learned a bit about what Jesus is like. We've learned that Jesus starts with us right where we are. We don't have to get our act together. We don't have to worry that we get all these other things in line. Jesus begins with us exactly where we are and loves us too much to leave us there. We've also learned that Jesus is able to see God's possibilities and not just our human limitations. And we found that challenging to think about what might be if God were to do it in a way that we never would have thought of. But what else is interesting to me in this story is that Jesus asks the man for a small step of faith. Maybe it's even bigger than we would think. But it's intriguing to me that Jesus asks the man if he would like to be made well, and he gives kind of some of the excuses for why he's been unable to get into the pool. But then Jesus asks him to do something that previously would have been impossible for him to do. Jesus doesn't say, well, I'm going to heal you. Jesus doesn't say you are healed. Jesus just says, get up. Notice what he says there in verse 8. Jesus said to him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Jesus told him to do what was impossible. And in merely speaking the words, Jesus performed a work of healing. We see the power in the word of Jesus in his words to the man. But Jesus asks the man to make a small step of faith. He wants him to demonstrate that he believes that what might have been impossible before now is possible because of the work, the power, and the grace of Jesus in his life. And we're told there that indeed, as the man begins to get up, he notices that his legs now have a strength they didn't have before. His legs now have the capacity to work in ways that they didn't have before. And in that small step of faith, this man discovers the incredible power of healing that Jesus can bring to someone's life. It's interesting to me, though, that often God asks of us a small step of faith. Something that perhaps we couldn't do on our own, and it's certainly not something that accomplishes the miracle for us. And in fact, there's little mentioned about the man's faith here, but Jesus does ask him to make a step of faith, and he often asks the same of us as God works in our lives. He may ask us to begin the process of seeing come to fruition that which we had prayed for or hoped for or trusted God for in our lives. We see that often in the scriptures. We see, for example, we saw last summer when we were doing the series on Joshua and the people crossing the Jordan River to get into the Promised Land. And God gave instructions there that the priests were to carry the Ark of the Covenant into the Jordan River, and God would stop the flow of water there that would enable the people to cross at a time when the water level would have been high. Now, what is interesting is that God didn't need the Ark of the Covenant in the waters to be able to stop them. God could stop the flow of the water at any point, but he asked that the priests carry the Ark into the river, and we're told that when their foot stepped into the water, that's when God stopped the flow. He asked of them a small step of faith to demonstrate their trust in him to provide, and once demonstrated, then God began to act in a way that accomplished that for them. We see the same kind of thing in the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem after the exile, in the book of Nehemiah, where God says that he's going to help them rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but God also requires of them the simple act of faith of putting mortar to stone and beginning to build up the wall. When the wall is rebuilt, and it's rebuilt in such a short period of time, even the folks who had opposed them in this were frightened because they recognized that this was a work of God, but God asked of the people the small step of putting some mortar to stone in the early part of that to help make that to happen. And we see the same kind of thing in the feeding of the 5,000 here in chapter 6 that we hinted at just a moment ago. Because one of the disciples shows up and says, hey, there's a kid here who's got his lunch. He's willing to share. He's got some bread and he's got some fish in there. Now, if I'm one of the disciples, I look at that and I just think, man, are you kidding? I'm glad he wanted to share, but there's not a chance. How are we going to feed 5,000 people with that? But again, that looks only at the circumstances through the eyes of our human limitations. But Jesus did ask of a simple step of faith on the part of the disciples when he gave thanks for it, when he blessed that food and he handed it to the disciples and he said, "Now I want you to begin to hand this out." And so the disciples take this small little bit and they step out and they begin to hand it to this person and to the next and to the next. And in that simple act of trust, they begin to see God work, so that in the end, all these people are fed. And not only are they fed, but Jesus asks for a further step of faith. And he says, "Now I want you to go around and gather up the leftovers." And the disciples begin to pick up a basket and they take it to this family who puts in what they can no longer eat. They're full. And then they hand it to this family and they begin to work their way through the crowd and discover in the process that God has done a dramatic miracle of multiplication. But Jesus asked of the disciples the simple step of faith. Often God asks the same of us. It may not mean that everything is at risk. It may not mean an act of absolute desperation, but it does ask of us the simple and obedient cooperation, a step of trust that demonstrates that we really believe that God can provide and work in this situation, perhaps in a way we never would have before. And we might finally say of this story in John chapter 5, this healing of the man who had been an invalid for so long, that here in this healing, Jesus also confirms his identity as the promised Messiah, as the Son of God, as the one who, being God, could provide the gift of salvation that each person so desperately needed, because he was doing the kinds of things that the Jews had read in the prophecies the Messiah would do. He's healing the blind. He's enabling the lame to walk again and afresh. He's fulfilling the kinds of prophecies that we read about in Isaiah chapter 35. Note there, for example, verses 5 and 6. "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy." Jesus is fulfilling the very prophecies that had given information about what the Messiah would do, what kind of ministry he would have among the people. So in doing this, Jesus is demonstrating that he is the promised Messiah. He is the one whom God had sent. And this becomes the great point of contention with the religious authorities of the time. This healing miracle kind of gets their attention initially because Jesus did it on the Sabbath. And not so much that Jesus did the healing, but then he asked the man to pick up his mat and carry it. Remember, he said, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Well, the authorities see this man walking around carrying his mat, and it's sad in some ways that rather than rejoicing over the fact that a man who had been an invalid, who had been disabled for 38 years now could walk, all they can see is the fact that he's breaking one of the rules. From the Sabbath, one was not to do work, and particularly the Pharisees of the day had a long list of very stringent provisions of what constituted work. And the man carrying his mat was working. He was working on the Sabbath, and so they began to question him. But ultimately, it's not so much his issue of working on the Sabbath, of carrying his mat on the Sabbath, that is a problem for them. It's what Jesus claims about himself really are. Jesus acknowledges that he is the Son of God. Jesus acknowledges that he is God. He shares in the divine nature as the second person of the Trinity, and they cannot accept that would be the case. Notice, for example, in verses 17 and 18, after this story that we read a few moments ago, Jesus said to them, "My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. For this reason, the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his Father, making himself equal with God." You see, Jews of the day might refer to our Father in heaven in a very general sort of way, but to refer to God as my Father was to make an implicit claim of divinity. But Jesus had gone even farther than that, and in doing so, the Jews recognized was making himself equal with God. He was claiming that he shared in God's divine nature, and for them that was blasphemy. They could not accept that about who Jesus was. You read on in verse 21, just a few verses later, Jesus says there, "For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it." Jesus is making claims about himself that the Jewish leaders of the day, the Pharisees in particular, could not find acceptable. Jesus was confirming that he was the Son of God, that he was God, and as such could accomplish the kinds of things that only God could do, even giving life to the dead, or in this case, enabling a man who had been unable to walk for 38 years to walk and to live again. We live in a day and in a culture when many cannot bring themselves to find those claims of Jesus acceptable as well. Jesus is at work in our midst, and stories like this man who was lame are a reminder that Jesus really was who he said he was. That he was able to deliver the goods. He was able to deliver on the claims that he was making about himself. And our willingness to accept that about him changes our eternity. We learn a lot in a story like this, don't we? And that same Jesus who enabled the legs of a man who had been unable to walk for 38 years to walk, that's the same Jesus who the Word tells us, as the Son of God, by his Spirit, lives within each of us who places our faith and trust in him. The same power that gave the capacity back to these legs to walk is the same power that resides within each one of us. Isn't that an awesome thought? And if that's the case, then we ought to be able to be a people who see our circumstances through the eyes of God's possibility. It's time that we set aside our excuses for God, why it is that we can't this or won't do that, and begin to embrace the impossible possibilities of a God who can do more than we can ask or imagine, because that God lives within the hearts of each of us who knows him by faith. I think that's a pretty strong challenge. And man, what a word of encouragement for me. It's hard to imagine the level of encouragement this man felt, a man who had laid there by that pool for so long. And God reaches out to us and says the same. What can I do in your life if you can see what my possibilities are, and not just what would keep you from experiencing that? That's the challenge today, from a man who experienced a miracle that he never even asked for.